The honourable member for St. John's South, Mount Pearl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, I want to thank the honourable member who spoke before me. I particularly liked his last expression near the end of that last question about drive-by consultation. You lower your window and you shout out, "What do you think?" And if that is the definition of consultation, of conservative consultation, I think he's pretty well dead on the money. I rise today to speak in support of Bill C-47, an act to enact the Nunavut Planning and Project Assessment Act and the Northwest Territories Surface Rights Board Act. The short title is the Northern Jobs and Growth Act. Why, as a Member of Parliament for Newfoundland and Labrador from the great riding of St. John's South Mount Pearl, speaking on a bill for the Northwest Territories? Well, Mr. Speaker, I feel that Labrador, in particular the Labrador part of my province, has a lot in common, has very much in common with the Northwest Territories. Labrador is a relatively untamed land. Labrador is a vast land. Labrador is known as the Big Land. Labrador is rich in minerals, rich in ore, rich in precious metals. Labrador is under constant exploration. Labrador is under constant development. The environment of Labrador is under constant pressure, be it from hydro development, renewable hydro development, or from new mines. We must be vigilant, Mr. Speaker. We must be vigilant to ensure there's balance between development and the impact of the environment. We must ensure there is balance in everything. The Northwest Territories, the North, must also be vigilant. This act, Mr. Speaker, is not perfect. It's far from perfect. We wanted to amend the bill at committee with changes based on witness testimony. But then all 50 opposition amendments, all 50 amendments were voted down, Mr. Speaker. The Conservatives ruled the amendments were out of order. I believe there were 50 NDP amendments and 3 Liberal amendments. But I'll come back to that in just a moment, Mr. Speaker. This bill packages 2 bills. It packages together 2 bills that should be considered separately. The first bill, the Nunavut Planning and Project Assessment Act, is pretty well a straightforward implementation of the Nunavut Land Claim Agreement. Simply put, it will improve regulatory regimes in the North. It will create a more efficient, it will create a more predictable regulatory regime. The roles, powers, the functions, the authorities of all parties, including how the members are appointed, will be clearly defined. These parties include the Nunavut Planning Commission, the Nunavut Impact Review Board, Inuit groups, and governments. The Act requires that Inuit and the Government of Canada establish a joint system to oversee the way that resources are managed in the territory. A joint system, Mr. Speaker. I do like the sound of that. Joint management. There have been calls in recent years for joint management of the East Coast fisheries, for example, Mr. Speaker. But I won't get into that right now. Give me time, Mr. Speaker. The second part of the bill, Mr. Speaker, is the Northwest Territories Surface Rights Board Act, and it's more complicated. It implements sections of 3 Aboriginal land claim agreements, but then the board would apply to all parts of the Northwest Territories. The board may receive applications from one or both parties to a dispute when a negotiated access agreement cannot be reached. A panel of the board would then conduct a hearing and determine the compensation, if there is to be compensation, and terms and conditions related to access. The board then makes an order containing the terms and conditions by which access can be exercised and any compensation payable for that access. When making its decision, the board must take into account market value, loss of use, effect on wildlife, damage, nuisance or inconvenience, cultural attachment. Mr. Speaker, the Mining Association of Canada welcomes this bill, particularly the inclusion of the Nunavut Planning and Project Assessment Act. They say it would help spur more responsible mining projects in the territory, which currently has one operating mine. This bill will result in a framework to determine how environmental assessment and permanent processes in Nunavut will proceed on a new land use plans for the land use plans for the territory come forward. And Mr. Speaker, they will most definitely come forward. Mr. Speaker, I have a quote from Pierre Graton, President and CEO of the Mining Association of Canada. Here's the quote. The legislation comes at a critical time for Nunavut, with its promising mineral potential and opportunities for economic development never before seen in the territory's history. Never before seen in the territory's history, Mr. Speaker. Here's another quote from Mr. Graton. By providing clarity and certainty around the regulatory framework, this new legislation will help give industry the confidence it needs to move forward with development decisions. The key word there, Mr. Speaker, is confidence. Over the next decade, the Mining Association of Canada estimates that new mine development across the north could bring more than $8 billion for investment in Nunavut. That could translate into some 4,500 new jobs and a significant increase in local business development. Mining, Mr. Speaker, is the largest private sector contributor in the north, making up 29% of the gross domestic product of the Northwest Territories. But mining is also a boom and bust industry, Mr. Speaker. The people of Labrador will tell you that. There are 45,000 people in the Northwest Territories, Northerners, Mr. Speaker, 45,000 Northerners. In Labrador, there are just over 26,000 people. They are both vast lands with few people. But we must ensure that the people benefit. We must ensure the industries thrive. We must ensure that the impact on the environment, we must also ensure this, that the impact on the environment is minimal. Mining has incredible ups. Mining has incredible downs, depending on the price of ore, depending, Mr. Speaker, on world markets. I mentioned earlier in my speech about the amendments we proposed to this bill, the 50 NDP amendments, the 50 suggestions from Northerners that were all voted down, each and every one voted down by the Conservatives. The proposed amendments included having the bill reviewed after 5 years. The amendments included creating a participant funding process and having hearings of the various boards and commissions held, Mr. Speaker, in public. In public. One amendment in particular tried to change the language around appointments to the boards, which hold that representatives must have knowledge of the land, they must have knowledge of the environment, and they must have traditional knowledge. The MP, the great MP for Western Arctic, who you've heard speak here earlier today, has said that all representatives should meet all three requirements: knowledge of the land, knowledge of the environment, and traditional knowledge. That didn't happen, Mr. Speaker. Those amendments were not adopted despite our best efforts, despite the best efforts of the New Democrats, of the opposition. But we still support this legislation. There are 3 points I want to wrap up with, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have 1 minute left, 2 minutes.
Time.
I forgot to say at the beginning of my speech, Mr. Speaker, that I will be splitting my time. But the question is, who I'll be splitting my time with. And I'm told that Phil Toon would be happy to fill in the second 10 minutes.
Order.
Oh, I see. Okay. Sorry about that, Mr. Speaker. It's
the honourable
good thing
member,
I asked. So I have
for Gaspésie, Ile Madeleine will be taking the second part of his time. The honourable member.
Thank you very much. There are 3 points I want to wrap up with, Mr. Speaker. First, that the New Democrats support consultation and consensus-based decision-making that respects the autonomy of the government of Nunavut and the Northwest Territories. Second, more consultations should have been allowed under Northwest Territories Surface Rights Board Act. Finally, third, New Democrats, led by the Member of Parliament for Western Arctic, will continue to fight for the rights of Northerners and the long-term prosperity of Northern communities. Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. The New Democrats support this bill. We support this bill. We will vote for this bill because the intent is there, because the intention is good. The bottom line is this: New Democrats don't want to get in the middle of an agreement between the government of Nunavut, to get in the middle of this agreement that the government of Nunavut has negotiated. But, Mr. Speaker, my party is concerned about the Northwest Territories Surface Rights Board Act and the fact that the act may have been rushed. That is why the series of more than 50 amendments we put forward were so important. The Conservatives used their majority on the committee to block all those amendments. Again, that the bill would be reviewed in 5 years, that a participant funding process would be created, and that hearings would be held on the various boards and commissions in public. And I'm just wrapping up, Mr. Speaker. How often does that happen, Mr. Speaker, that the Conservatives would use the majority to grab through their will?
Order.
Too often, Mr.
Oh.
Speaker.
Yeah. Honourable member may have to get those last few points in the course of questions and comments. Question et commentaire.
Questions and comments.
L'honorable député de
The honourable member for Montmorency, Charlevoix-Côte-Nord. My colleague talked about 50 amendments that were tabled and rejected by the government. This should have been done for years, and now we're in an emergency situation. There are people that are worried. They would like to bring forth amendment, people from the north who really know the reality out there, and that would like to amend this bill. There are people who are worried, so I'm wondering whether my colleague is also worried about this, whether there'll be time, and whether the government will respect our parliamentary system.
John South Mount Pearl.
I thank the honourable member for the question. Thank you very much. The amendments, some of those 50 amendments that my party brought forward, the most important from my perspective were first, that the bill would be reviewed after 5 years. That was very important, and from my perspective, Mr. Speaker, that was common sense. That was absolutely reasonable. And the second was that having hearings of the various boards and commissions be held in public. I also look at that as common sense. In terms of what will happen with these amendments, the honourable member who spoke just before me mentioned how in 2015, when our party takes government, I think that will be the opportunity to take a second look at some of these amendments and to see what we can do then. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments.